This is democracy, the god that failed, the economics and politics of monarchy, democracy, and natural order, by Hermann Hoppe. We have here first a cover page reading what I've already stated, and then yet another title page, Democracy, the God That Failed. We have a blank page followed by yet another title page, Democracy, the God That Failed, the Economics and Politics of Monarchy, Democracy, and Natural Order, by Hermann Hoppe. Printed by Transaction Publishers of New Brunswick. New Brunswick is a province of Canada. Why do they say New Brunswick, USA? That is bizarre. In any case, New Brunswick, USA, and London, United Kingdom. Now, just to note, we're actually reading this off of an ebook edition here. I don't actually currently retain a hard copy of this text, so just something to bear in mind. Now we have the credits page. 9th paperback printing, 2007. Copyright C 2001 by Transaction Publishers, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Ah, I see. So New Brunswick isn't referring to the province, they're referring to the city in New Jersey, the state of New Jersey. That makes sense. In any case, all rights reserved under international and Pan-American copyright conventions. No part of this book may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopy, recording, or any information storage and retrieval system, without prior permission in writing from the publisher. All inquiries should be addressed to Transaction Publishers, Rutgers, The State University, 35 Beru Circle, Piscataway, New Jersey, 08854-8042, by which I would assume that to be their postal code. And they have a website as well, www.transactionpub.com. This book is printed on acid-free paper that meets the American National Standard for Permanence of Paper for Printed Library Materials. Library of Congress Catalog Number 20010273880, ISBN number 978-0-7658-0088-6, in brackets cloth, by which I assume they mean there was a cloth-bound softcover or hardcover copy of some kind published at some point. And also they have here 978-0-7658-0868-4, in brackets paperback, printed in the United States of America. Library of Congress Cataloging in Publication Data. Hoppe, Hermann. Democracy, the God That Failed, the Economics and Politics of Monarchy, Democracy, and Natural Order, / Hermann Hoppe. P decimal CM decimal. I don't know what that refers to, but nonetheless, continuing on. Includes bibliographical references and index. ISBN number 0-7658-0088-8, in brackets cloth alkaline paper. Interesting. So they had a cloth-bound volume with alkaline paper on the cover. For some reason they had that. That's a very unusual publishing method. And then the other one, of course, ISBN number 0-7658-0868-4, paperback on alkaline paper. 1. Economics, political aspects, by which I assume they mean the chapter here. 2. Economics, moral and ethical aspects. 3. Economic policy. 4. Monarchy. 5. Democracy. 6. Anarchy. 7. State, the economic aspects, and 1. Title. That's okay. In any case here, Next we have, before I continue on, some other string of numbers and seeming gibberish at the base of the page. HB74.P65 with a space there, and then H66, 2001, which would be the year of publication. And then below that, 321.8-DE, pardon me, yes, DE. It's either DE or DC. It's too small to actually tell. If I zoom in here, I do believe that is, in fact, DC. DC21. And then on the other end of the page, they have 2001 027380. Next, the contents of this document. Acknowledgments VII. So that would be the, again, those are in Roman numerals. So that would be 7, by which I assume they mean page 7, but that's part of the prequel. So I don't know. Maybe that is inferring something regarding like 7 pages prior to the start. I don't know. And then we have the introduction, which is marked as IX, which, let me think here, if a V is 5 in Roman numerals, then an X would be, I'm going to say 10, although I could be wrong, which means that would be up to page 9. And then we have the actual, oh, I see. So they have like the acknowledgments and introduction on a separate numbering scale to the rest of the text. So when the text itself actually starts, then they start counting chronologically in normal numbers. So chapter 1 on time preference, government, and the processes of decivilization runs from page 1 to page 44. Chapter 2 on monarchy, democracy, and the idea of natural order runs from page 45 to 76. Chapter 3 on monarchy, democracy, public opinion, and delegitimation runs from page 77 to 94. On democracy, redistribution, and the destruction of property runs from page 95 to 106. Chapter 5 on centralization and secession runs from page 107 to 120. Chapter 6 on socialization and desocialization runs from page 121 to 136. Chapter 7 on free immigration and forced integration runs from pages 137 to page 150. Chapter 8 on free trade and restricted immigration runs from page 151 to page 170. Chapter 9 on cooperation, tribe, city, and state runs from page 171 to page 186. Chapter 10 on conservatism and libertarianism runs from page 187 to page 220. Chapter 11 on the errors of classical liberalism and the future of liberty runs from page 221 to page 238. Chapter 12 on government and the private production of defense runs from page 239 to page 266. Chapter 13 on the impossibility of limited government and the prospect for revolution runs from page 267 to page 292, which then brings us at last to the index of this text, which is listed on page 293 initially at the outset and continues to the end of this volume. We then have another blank page as a spacer, and then begins the acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Most of the following studies have grown out of speeches delivered at various conferences sponsored by the Ludwig von Mises Institute and the Center for Libertarian Studies. Several of them have been published previously at different locations and in various translations. However, for the present occasion, all of them have been systematically revised and substantially enlarged. I thank Lewin H. Rockwell, Jr., president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and Burton S. Blumert, president of the Center for Libertarian Studies, for their continual support, financially and personally, in developing and elaborating the ideas presented herein. Others who afforded me a forum to express and test my ideas and thus contributed to the present work include Christian Comenceau, Robert Neff, Gerard Radnitsky, I don't know how to pronounce that, it's some Jewish name, Jiri Schwartz, Jesus Huart de Soto, and Joseph Sima. Thanks go to them, as well as to an anonymous benefactor for his ongoing financial support. For many years I have been blessed with the friendship of Walter Bloch, David Gordon, Jeffrey Herbener, Guido Hulsmann, Stefan Kinzella, Ralph Ryko, and Joseph Salerno. While none of them can be held responsible for any of my ideas, all of them, through suggestions and criticisms in countless conversations, as well as their own scholarly writings, have exercised an indelible effect on my thinking. Even more important has been the influence of Ludwig von Mises and Murray N. Rothbard. My intellectual debt to their work is notable and, I can only hope, has been dutifully and adequately acknowledged throughout the following studies. To Murray and Rothbard, with whom I was fortunate to have been closely associated during the last decade of his life, I further owe a profound personal debt. His friendship and his example of moral courage and of the ability to stay kind and indeed cheerfully optimistic in the face even of seemingly overwhelming adversity have deeply and lastingly affected my own conduct and outlook on life. Last but not least, I want to thank my wife, Margaret Rudlich Hoppe, not just for assuming for more than 20 years now the thankless task of editing my English writings, but for always finding the time and energy in between her work, household, and care for our 2 teenage children to provide me with encouragement, comfort, and the utmost happiness. We have yet another spacer page here, followed by the introduction. Introduction. World War I marks one of the great watersheds of modern history. With its end, the transformation of the entire Western world from monarchical rule and sovereign kings to democratic republican rule and sovereign people that began with the French Revolution was at last completed. Until 1914, only 3 republics had existed in Europe: France, Switzerland, and, after 1911, Portugal. And of all major European monarchies, only the United Kingdom could be classified as a parliamentary system, i.e., one in which supreme power was vested in an elected parliament. Only 4 years later, after the United States had entered the European War and decisively determined its outcome, monarchies all but disappeared, and Europe, along with the entire world, entered the age of democratic republicanism. In Europe, the military defeated Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, God, I'm butchering that name, and Habsburgs had to abdicate or resign, and Russia, Germany, and Austria became democratic republics with universal, both male and female, suffrage and parliamentary governments. Likewise, all of the newly created successor states, with the sole exception of Yugoslavia, adopted democratic republican constitutions. In Turkey and Greece, the monarchies were overthrown, and even where monarchies remained nominally in existence, as in Great Britain, Italy, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands, as well as Scandinavian countries, monarchies no longer existed and no longer exercised any governing power, in point of fact. Universal adult suffrage was introduced, and all government power was vested in parliaments and quote-unquote public officials. The world historic transformation from the ancient regime of royal or princely rulers to the new democratic republican age of popularity and popularly elected or chosen rulers may be also characterized as that from Austria and the Austrian way to that of America and the American way. This is true for several reasons. First, Austria initiated the war, and America brought it to the close. Austria lost, and America won. Austria was ruled by a monarch, Emperor Franz Joseph, and America by a democratically elected president, Professor Woodrow Wilson. More importantly, however, World War I was not a traditional war fought over limited territorial objectives, but an ideological one, and Austria and America respectively were perceived as such by the contending parties, the two countries that most clearly embodied the ideas in conflict with each other. There is listed an editor's note for that. However, I regrettably do not have any means of accessing it. Oh, actually I do. I stand corrected. The note appears to be at the base of the page. For a brilliant summary of the causes and consequences of World War I, see Ralph Ryko, World War I, The Turning Point, in The Costs of War, America's Pyrrhic Victories, John V. Denson edition, New Brunswick, New Jersey, Transaction Publishers, 1999. Continuing now. World War I began as an old-fashioned territorial dispute. However, with the early involvement and the ultimate official entry into the war by the United States in April of 1917, the war took on a new ideological dimension. The United States had been founded as a republic, and the democratic principle inherent in the idea of a republic had only been recently carried to victory as the result of the violent defeat and devastation of the secessionist Confederacy by the centralist Union government. At the time of World War I, this triumphant ideology of an expansionist democratic republicanism had found its very personification in then U.S. President Wilson. Under Wilson's administration, the European war became an ideological mission to make the world safe for democracy and free of dynastic rulers. When in March of 1917, the United States allied Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate and a new democratic republican government was established in Russia under Kerensky, Wilson was elated. With the Tsar gone, the war had finally become a purely ideological conflict of good against evil. Wilson and his closest foreign policy advisors, George D. Herron and Colonel House, disliked the Germany of the Kaiser, the aristocracy, and the military elite, but they hated Austria. As Erich von Kauhnelt-Ledin has characterized the views of Wilson and the American left, quote, Austria was far more wicked than Germany. It existed in contradiction of the Mazzinian principle of the nation-state. It had inherited many traditions, as well as symbols from the Holy Roman Empire, in brackets, the double-headed eagle, black gold colors, etc. Its dynasty had once ruled over Spain, another Bête Noire. It had led the Counter-Reformation, headed the Holy Alliance, fought against the Risorgimento, suppressed the Magyar rebellion under Kossuth, who had a monument in New York City, and morally supported the monarchical experiment in Mexico. Habsburg, the very name evoked memories of Roman Catholicism, of the Armada, the Inquisition, Metternich, Lafayette jailed at Olmütz, and Silvio Pellico in Brun's Spielberg Fortress. Such a state has to be shattered. Such a dynasty had to disappear. For which we have the citation, Erich von Kauhnelt-Ledin, Leftism Revisited, From Decide to Pol Pot, Washington, D.C., Regnery, 1990, page 210, on Wilson and Wilsonianism. See further Murray N., by which they mean Murray N. Rothbard. Continuing here, page XI, which I would have presumed to be pre-page 11. As an increasingly ideologically motivated conflict, The war quickly degenerated into a total war. Everywhere, the entire national economy was militarized, in brackets, war socialism, for which we have the citation down below. C. Murray and Rothbard, War Collectivism in World War I, in A New History of Leviathan, Ronald Radosh and Murray and Rothbard editions, New York edition, E.P. Dutton, 1972, Robert Higgs, Crisis in Leviathan, New York, Oxford University Press, 1987, pardon me. And up above that, they have another citation, which I don't know why that's there, as this is the first section of the page, so I'll read that out as well, just in the off chance it might be related. And it does in fact appear to be. Rothbard, World War I, as Fulfillment, Power, and the Intellectuals, Journey of Libertarian Studies 9, Number 1, 1989, Paul Gottfried, Wilsonianism, The Legacy That Won't Die, Journal of Libertarian Studies 9, Number 2, 1990, Idem on Liberal and Democratic Nationhood, Journal of Libertarian Studies 10, I suppose that means 10th edition, Number 1, 1991, Robert A. Nisbet, The Present Age, New York, Harper and Row, 1988. Why they list that here as a citation, despite not actually directly citing it in the text, I honestly couldn't say. From the sounds of it, those are just sort of general pieces of information they used as background research, and they, I guess, threw it in here without actually needing to directly cite anything from it, sort of as a, if you're interested in this, here's where you can get more info, as a generality, not as a direct citation type thing. In any case, let's take this from the top of the page. As an increasingly ideologically motivated conflict, the war quickly degenerated into a total war. Everywhere, the entire national economy was militarized, in brackets, war socialism, and the time-honored distinction between combatants and non-combatants and military and civilian life fell by the wayside. For this reason, World War I resulted in many more civilian casualties, victims of starvation and disease, than of soldiers killed on the battlefields. Moreover, due to the ideological character of the war, at its end no compromise peace, but only total surrender, utter humiliation and punishment was possible. Germany had to give up her monarchy, and Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France as before the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. The new German Republic was burdened with heavy long-term reparations. Germany was demilitarized. The German Saarland was occupied by the French, and in the east, large territories had to be ceded to Poland, in brackets, West Prussia and Silesia. However, Germany was not dismembered and destroyed. Wilson had reserved this fate for Austria. With the deposition of the Habsburgs, the entire Austrian-Hungarian Empire, by which they presumably mean Austro-Hungarian Empire, as it's typically rendered in the modern day, was dismembered. As the crowning achievement of Wilson's foreign policy, two new and artificial states, namely Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, were carved out of the former empire. Austria herself, for centuries one of Europe's great powers, was reduced in size to its small German-speaking heartland. And, as another of Wilson's legacies, tiny Austria was forced to surrender its entirely German province of southern Tyrolia, extending to the Brenner Pass, to Italy. Since 1918, Austria has disappeared from the map of international power politics. Instead, the United States has emerged as the world's leading superpower. The American age, the Pax Americana, had begun. The principle of democratic republicanism had triumphed. It was to triumph again with the end of World War II, and once more, or so it seemed, with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in the late 1980s and early 1990s. For some contemporary observers, the quote-unquote end of history had arrived. the American idea of universal and global democracy had finally come into its own. And for the quotation on that is cited as C. Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man, New York, Avon Books, 1992. Meanwhile, Habsburg Austria and the prototypical pre-democratic Austrian experience assumed no more than historical interest. To be sure, it was not that Austria had not achieved any recognition. Even democratic intellectuals and artists from any field of intellectual and cultural endeavor could not ignore the enormous level of productivity of Austro-Hungarian and, in particular, Viennese culture. Indeed, the list of great names associated with late 19th and early 20th century Vienna is seemingly endless. For which we have the citation below. The list includes Ludwig Boltzmann, Franz Brentano, Rudolf Carnap, Edmund Husserl, Ernst Mach, Alexius Meinong, Karl Popper, Moritz Schlick, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, among philosophers. Kurt Gödel, Hans Hahn, Karl Menger, and Richard von Mises among mathematicians. Eugene von Bohm-Bawerk, Gottfried von Haberlehrl, I'm butchering these names, God help me, Friedrich A. von Hayek, Karl Menger, Fritz Machlup, Ludwig von Mises, Osak Morgenstern, Joseph Schumpeter, and Friedrich von Weiser. Among economists, Rudolf von Jhering, Hans Kelsen, Anton Menger, and Lorenz von Stein among lawyers and legal theorists. Alfred Adler, Joseph Brauer, Karl Buehler, and Sigmund Freud among psychologists. Max Adler, Otto Bauer, Egon Friedel, Heinrich Freidjung, Paul Lazarfeld, Gustav Ratzenfohler, and Alfred Schutz among historians and sociologists. Hermann Brock, Franz Grillparzer, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Karl Kraus, Fritz Mauchner, Robert Musil, Arthur Schnitzler, George Trakl, Otto Weininger, and Stefan Zweig among writers and literary critics. Gustav Klimt, Oskar Kochschka, Adolf Loos, and Egon Schiele among artists and architects. Alban Berg, Johannes Brahms, Anton Bruckner, Franz Lehar, Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schoenberg, Johann Strauss, Anton von Webern, and Hugo Wolf among musical composers. That's a very long list of names, but the gist of it is that Austria and Germany had a lot of very powerful, intelligent, intellectual people being brought up within its borders, and that when the state collapsed, it led to a massive amount of decay within Europe, I think is what they're insinuating here. Anyway, continuing on next, here we have the following citation. However, rarely has this enormous intellectual and cultural productivity been brought in a However, rarely has this enormous intellectual and cultural productivity been brought in a systematic connection with the pre-democratic tradition of the Habsburg monarchy. Instead, if it had not been considered a mere coincidence, the productivity of Austrian Viennese culture has been presented, quote, politically correctly, end quote, as proof of the positive synergistic effects of a multi-ethnic society and of multiculturalism. For which we have the quote, see Alan Janik and Stefan Tolmin, Wittgenstein, Vienna, New York, Simon and Schuster, 1973, William M. Johnson, The Austrian Mind, An Intellectual and Social History, 1848 to 1938, Berkeley University of California Press, 1972, Carl E. Schorske, Fin de siècle, Vienna, Politics and Culture, New York, Random House, 1981. Now, picking up from below at the end of that. However, at the end of the 20th century, increasing evidence is accumulating that rather than marking the end of history, the American system is itself in a deep crisis. Since the late 1960s or early 1970s, real wage incomes in the United States of America and in Western Europe have stagnated or even fallen. In Western Europe in particular, unemployment rates have been steadily edging upward and are currently exceeding 10%. The public debt has risen everywhere to astronomical heights, in many cases exceeding a country's annual gross domestic product. Yes, if you have a debt to GDP ratio of over 100%, that's kind of scary. Continuing here. Similarly, the social security systems everywhere are on or near the verge of bankruptcy. Further, the collapse of the Soviet Empire represented not so much a triumph of democracy as the bankruptcy of the ideal of socialism, and it therefore also contained an indictment against the American, read Western, system of democratic rather than dictatorial socialism. Moreover, throughout the Western Hemisphere, national, ethnic, and cultural divisiveness, separatism, and secessionism are on the rise. Wilson's multicultural democratic creations, namely Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, have broken apart. In the United States, less than a century of full-blown democracy has resulted in steadily increasing moral degeneration, family and social disintegration, and cultural decay in the form of continually rising rates of divorce, illegitimacy, abortion, and crime. As a result of an ever-expanding list of non-discrimination, quote-unquote, affirmative action laws and non-discriminatory, multicultural, egalitarian immigration policies, every nook and cranny of American society is affected by government management, or perhaps mismanagement, and forced integration. Accordingly, social strife and racial, ethnic, and moral cultural tension and hostility have increased dramatically as a consequence. In light of these disillusioning experiences, fundamental doubts concerning the virtues of the American system have resurfaced. What would have happened, it is being asked again, if in accordance with his re-election promise, Woodrow Wilson had kept the United States out of World War I. By virtue of its counterfactual nature, the answer to a question such as this can never be empirically confirmed or falsified. However, this does not make the question meaningless or the answer arbitrary. To the contrary, based on an understanding of the actual historical events and personalities involved, the question concerning the most likely alternative course of history can be answered in detail and with considerable confidence. We have here a citation for that. For a contemporary collection of examples of quote-unquote counterfactual history, see Virtual History, Alternatives and Counterfactuals, Niall Ferguson edition, New York, Basic Books, 1999. If the United States of America had followed a strict non-interventionist foreign policy, it is likely that the intra-European conflict would have ended in late 1916 or as early as 1917 as the result of several peace initiatives, most notably the Austrian Emperor Charles I. Moreover, the war would have been concluded with a mutually acceptable and face-saving compromise and a compromised peace, rather than the actual diktat. Consequently, Austria-Hungary Germany and Russia would have remained traditional monarchies instead of being turned into short-lived democratic republics. With a Russian Tsar and a German and Austrian Kaiser in place, it would have been almost impossible for the Bolsheviks to seize power in Russia. And in reaction to a growing communist threat in Western Europe for the fascists and National Socialists to do much the same in Italy and Germany. The citation for that: on the relationship between communism and the rise of fascist and nationalist socialism, see Ralph Raico, Mises on Fascism, Democracy, and Other Questions, Journal of Libertarian Studies 12, number 1, published 1996, Ernst Nolte, Der Europäische Bürgerkrieg, by which I would translate that to roughly the European Paradise something war. I don't know what Berger would be. In any case, 1917 to 1945. National Sozialismus und Bolschewismus, Berlin, Propylaen, 1987. So when they say National Socialismus, that would be National Socialism and Bolshevism, Berlin, something 1987. Continuing now with the text from where we left off. Millions of victims of communism, National Socialism, and World War II would have been spared. The extent of government interference and control of the private economy in the United States and in Western Europe would never have reached the heights seen today. And rather than Central and Eastern Europe, and consequently half the globe, falling into communist hands, and for more than 40 years being plundered, devastated, and forcibly insulated from Western markets, all of Europe and the entire globe would have remained integrated economically, as in the 19th century, in a worldwide system of division of labor and cooperation. World living standards would have grown immensely higher than they actually have. Before the backdrop of this thought experiment and the actual course of events, the American system and the Pax Americana appear, contrary to quote-unquote official history, which is always written by its victors, i.e., from the perspective of the proponents of democracy, to be nothing short of an unmitigated disaster. In Habsburg Austria and the pre-democratic age appear most appealing, for which they have the citation, no less of an establishmentarian than George F. Kennan. Who the fuck is George F. Kennan? Writing in 1951, came indeed close to admitting as much, when he said, "Yet today, if one were offered the chance of having back again the Germany of 1913, a Germany run by conservative but relatively moderate people, no Nazis and no communists, a vigorous Germany, united and unoccupied, full of energy and confidence, able to play a part yet again in the blanching off of Russian power in Europe, well, there would be would there be objections to it from many quarters. There would be objections to it from many quarters, and it wouldn't make everyone happy. But in many ways, it wouldn't be so bad in comparison with our problems today." Now think what that means when you tally up the total score of the two world wars in terms of their ostensible objectives. You find if there had been any gain at all, it is pretty hard to discern. In brackets, American Diplomacy, 1900 to 1950, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1951, pages 55 and 56. Continuing now. Millions of... Actually, wait a second here. I stand corrected. I may have... yes, we are. Certainly then, it would be worthwhile to take a systematic and systemic look at the historic transformation from monarchy to democracy. While history will play an important role, the following is not the work of a historian, however, but of a political economist and philosopher. There are no new or unfamiliar data presented here. Rather, insofar as a claim to originality is made, it is that the following studies contain new and unfamiliar interpretations of generally well-known and accepted facts. Moreover, that it is the interpretation of facts rather than the facts themselves which are of central concern to the scientist and the subject of most contention and debate. One may, for instance, readily agree on the fact that the 19th century in America, average living standards, tax rates, and economic regulations were comparatively low, while in the 20th century, living standards, taxes, and regulations were high. Yet were 20th century living standards higher because of higher taxes and regulations, or in spite of higher taxes and regulations? I.e., would living standards be yet higher if taxes and regulations had remained as low as they had been during the 19th century? Likewise, one may readily agree that welfare payments and crime rates were low during the 1950s, and that both are now comparatively high. Yet has crime increased because of rising welfare payments, or despite them? Or have crime and welfare nothing to do with one another, and is the relationship between the two phenomena merely coincidental? The facts do not provide an answer to such questions, and no amount of statistical manipulation of data can possibly change this fact. The data of history are logically compatible with any of such rival interpretations, and historians, insofar as they are just historians, have no way of deciding in favor of one or the other of these conclusions. If one is to make a rational choice among such rival and incompatible interpretations, this is only possible if one has a theory at one's disposal, or at least a theoretical proposition whose validity does not depend on historical experience but can be established a priori, i.e., once and for all by means of the intellectual apprehension or comprehension of the nature of things. In some circles, this kind of theory is held in low esteem, and some philosophers, especially of the empiricist positivist variety, have declared any such theory off limits or even impossible. This is not a philosophical treatise devoted to a discussion of issues of epistemology and ontology. Here and in the following, I do not want to directly refute the empiricist positivist thesis that there is no such thing as an a priori theory, i.e., proposition which asserts something about reality and can be validated independent of the outcome of any future experience. For which we have the citation, see on this subject Ludwig von Mises' Theory and History, an interpretation of the social and economic evolution, Auburn, Alabama, Ludwig von Mises Institute, 1985. It is only appropriate, however, to acknowledge from the outset that I consider this thesis, and indeed the entire empiricist positivist research program, which can be interpreted as the result of the application of the egalitarian principles of democracy to the realm of knowledge and research, and has therefore dominated ideologically during most of the 20th century, as fundamentally mistaken and thoroughly refuted. For which we have the citation listed as C. Brand Blanchard, Reasons and Analysis, LaSalle, Indiana, Open Court, 1964. Also Arthur Papp, Semantics and Necessary Truth, New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press, 1958. Saul Kripke, Naming and Necessity in Semantics of Natural Language. Donald Davidson and Gilbert Harman editions, New York, Rydell, 1972. And Paul Lorenz, another German name, Methodisches Denken, Frankfurt M. Schurkampf, 1968. And above that, we have another citation which is listed here but isn't actually directly numbered or anything of that kind, which reads, Idem, The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, an essay on method, Kansas City, Sheed, Andrews, and McNeil, 1978, Hans Hermann Hoppe, Kritik der Kausalwissenschaftlichen Sozialforschung another German word, Untersuchungen zur Grundlegung von Soziologie und Ökonomie, by which they mean something about the sociology and the economy. Opalden Westdeutscher Verlag, 1983, Idem, Economic Science and the Austrian Method, Auburn, Alabama, Ludwig von Mises Institute, 1995. All right, picking up from where we left off here. Here it suffices to present just a few examples of what is meant by a priori theory, and in particular to cite some such examples from the realm of the social sciences, in order to put any possible suspicion to rest and recommend my theoretical approach as intuitively plausible and in accordance with common sense. For which we have the citation, even a good empiricist, quote-unquote, would have to admit that, according to his own doctrine, he cannot possibly know a priori whether or not a priori theorems exist and may be used to decide between incompatible explanations of one and the same set of historical data. Hence, he would have to adopt a wait-and-see attitude, too. Examples of what I mean by a priori theory are: no material thing can be at two places at once. No two objects can occupy the same place. A straight line is the shortest line between 2 points. No two straight lines can enclose a space. Whatever object is red all over cannot be green, which is to say blue, yellow, etc., all over. Whatever object is colored is also extended. Whatever object has shape has also size. If A is a part of B and B is a part of C, then A is a part of C. 4 equals 3 plus 1, 6 equals 2 times 33 minus 30, in brackets there. Implausibility, empiricists must denigrate such positions as mere linguistic, syntactic conventions without any empirical content, i.e., empty tautologies. In contrast to this view, and in accordance with common sense, I understand the same positions as asserting some simple but fundamental truths about the structure of reality. And in accordance with common sense, too, I would regard someone who wanted to, quote-unquote, test these propositions, or who reported, quote-unquote, facts contradicting or deviating from them as confused on a fundamental level. A priori theory trumps and corrects experience, in brackets, and logic overrules observation, and not vice versa. Next page here, XVII. More importantly, examples of a priori theory also abound in the social sciences, in particular in the field of political economy and the field of philosophy. Human action is an actor's purposeful pursuit of valued ends with scarce means. No one can purposefully not act. Every action is aimed at improving the actor's subjective well-being above what it otherwise would have been. A large quantity of a good is valued more highly than a smaller quantity of the same good. Satisfaction earlier is preferred over satisfaction later. Production must precede consumption. What is consumed now cannot be consumed again in the future. If the price of a good is lowered, either the same quantity or more will be bought than otherwise. Prices fixed below market clearing prices will lead to lasting shortages. Without private property in factors of production, there can be no factor prices. And without factor prices, cost accounting is impossible. Taxes are an imposition on producers and/or wealth owners and reduce production and/or wealth below what it otherwise would have been. Interpersonal conflict is possible only if and insofar as things are scarce. I would debate that one personally. No thing or part of a thing can be owned exclusively by more than one person at a time. Democracy, which is to say majority rule, is incompatible with private property, which is in brackets here listed as individual ownership and rule. No form of taxation can be uniform, which is to say equal. But every taxation involves the creation of two distinct and unequal classes of taxpayers versus tax receiver consumers. Property and property titles are distinct entities, and an increase of the latter without a corresponding increase of the former does not raise social wealth, but leads to a redistribution of existing wealth. For an empiricist, propositions such as these must be interpreted as either stating nothing empirical at all and being mere speech conventions, or as forever testable and tentative hypotheses. To us, as to common sense, they are neither. In fact, it strikes us as utterly disingenuous to portray these propositions as having no empirical content. Clearly, they state something about quote-unquote real things and events. And it seems similarly disingenuous to regard these propositions as hypotheses. Hypothetical propositions, as commonly understood, are statements such as these. Children prefer McDonald's over Burger King. By the way, for those not aware, those are brands of fast food that are based originally out of the United States. The worldwide ratio of beef to pork consumption spending is 2-to-1. Germans prefer Spain over Greece as a vacationing destination. Longer education in public schools will lead to higher wages. The volume of shopping shortly before Christmas exceeds that of shortly after Christmas. Catholics vote predominantly Democratic, quote-unquote. Japanese save a quarter of their disposable income. Germans drink more beer than the Frenchmen. The United States of America produces more computers than any other country. Most inhabitants of the U.S. are white and of European descent. Propositions such as these require the collection of historical data to be validated, and they must be continually re-evaluated because the assertion and the asserted relationships are not necessarily, but, in quotes, contingent ones. That is, because there is nothing inherently impossible, inconceivable, or plain wrong in assuming the opposite of the above. Example, that children prefer Burger King to McDonald's, or Germans Greece to Spain, etc. This, however, is not the case with the former theoretical propositions. To negate these propositions and assume, for instance, that a smaller quantity of a good might be preferred to a larger one of the same good, that what is being consumed now can possibly be consumed again in future, or that cost accounting could be accomplished also without factor prices, strikes one as utterly absurd. And anyone engaged in empirical research, quote-unquote, and testing, quote-unquote, to determine which one of two contradictory propositions such as these does or does not hold water appears to be either a fool or a fraud. According to the approach adopted here, theoretical propositions like the ones just cited are accepted for what they appear to be, as statements about necessary facts and relations. As such, they can be illustrated by historical data. But historical data can neither establish nor refute them, for which we have here the citation, to avoid any misunderstanding. To say that something is, quote-unquote, necessary and can be recognized as such, in quotes here, a priori, is not to claim that one is infallible. Mathematicians and logicians, too, claim to be concerned with necessary relations, and yet they do not claim to be infallible. Rather, what is claimed is in this regard is only that in order to refute a theoretical proposition, in contrast to a hypothetical one, another, even more fundamental theoretical argument is required, just as another mathematical or logistical proof or argument is required and not empirical evidence, in order to refute a mathematical or logical theorem. Returning now to the text. To the contrary, even if historical experience is necessary in order to initially grasp a theoretical insight, this insight concerns facts and relations that extend and transcend logically beyond any particular historical experience. Hence, once a theoretical insight has been grasped, it can be employed as a constant and permanent standard of quote-unquote criticism, i.e., for the purpose of correcting, revising, and rejecting, as well as of accepting historical reports and interpretations. For instance, based on theoretical insights, it must be considered impossible that higher taxes and regulations can be the cause of higher living standards. Living standards can be higher only despite higher taxes and regulations. Similarly, theoretical insights can rule out reports such as that increased consumption has led to increased production, in brackets, economic growth, that below market clearing, in bracket, maximum prices, by which they're referring here to price controls, have resulted in unsold surpluses of goods, or that the absence of democracy has been responsible for the economic malfunctioning of socialism as nonsensical. As a matter of theory, only more saving in capital formation and/or advances in productivity can lead to increased production. Only guaranteed above market clearing, in bracket, minimum prices, can result in lasting surpluses, and only the absence of private property is responsible for the economic plight under socialism. And to reiterate, none of these insights requires further empirical study or testing. To study or test them is a sign of confusion. When I noted earlier that this is not the work of a historian, but of a political economist and philosopher, I obviously did not believe this to be a disadvantage. Quite the contrary, in fact. As has been indicated, historians qua... What does he mean by qua here? Historians qua historians... Oh, I see. He means quote-unquote historians. He's like doing air quotes or something. Historians, quote-unquote, cannot rationally decide between incompatible interpretations of the same set of data or sequence of events. Hence, they are unable to provide answers to most important social questions. The principal advantage that the political economist and philosopher have over the mere historian, and the benefits to be gained from the study of political economy and philosophy by the historian, is his knowledge of a pure a priori social theory, which enables him to avoid otherwise unavoidable errors in the interpretation of sequences of complex historical data and present a theoretically corrected or reconstructed, quote-unquote, and a decidedly critical or, quote-unquote, revisionist account of history. Based on and motivated by fundamental theoretical insights from both political economy and political philosophy, in brackets, ethics, in the following studies, I propose the revision of three central, indeed almost mythical, beliefs and interpretations concerning modern history. In accordance with elementary theoretical insights regarding the nature of private property and ownership versus public property and administration, and of firms versus governments, in brackets, or states, I propose first a revision of the prevailing view of traditional heredity and hereditary monarchies, and provide instead an uncharacteristically favorable interpretation of monarchy and the monarchical experience. In short, monarchical government is reconstructed theoretically as privately owned government, which in turn is explained as promoting future-orientedness and a concern for capital values and economic calculation by the government ruler. Second, equally unorthodox, but by the same theoretical token, democracy and the democratic experience are cast in an untypically unfavorable light. Democratic government is reconstructed as publicly owned government, which is explained as leading to present-orientedness and a disregard or neglect of capital values in government rulers, and the transition from monarchy to democracy is interpreted accordingly as civilizational decline. Breaking here from the text for a moment, that actually makes a lot of sense. Basically what he's saying is, in an absolute monarchy, the king is like the landowner and the country is his private property, in effect. And therefore, because he owns it, he will treat it better than somebody who's just renting the place, which is the case in democracy because nobody's ever in power long enough to have any real desire to build a sound legacy for the future, whether that be the individuals in government or the populace themselves. So, yeah, that actually sounds very logical when you actually think about it. Now here, continuing what I believe to be pre-page 20 for the introduction here, XX. Still more fundamental and unorthodox is the proposed third revision. Despite the comparatively favorable portrait presented of monarchy, I myself am not a monarchist, and the following is not a defense of monarchy. Instead, the position taken towards monarchy is this. If one must have a state, defined as an agency that exercises a compulsory territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making, in brackets jurisdiction, and of taxation, then it is economically and ethically advantageous to choose monarchy over democracy. But this leaves the question open whether or not a state itself is necessary, i.e. if there exists an alternative to both, monarchy and democracy. History again cannot provide an answer to this question. By definition, there can be no such thing as an experience, quote-unquote, of counterfactuals and alternatives. And all one finds in modern history, at least insofar as the developed Western world is concerned, is the history of states and statism. Only theory can again provide an answer, for theoretical propositions are just illustrated. Only theory can again provide an answer for theoretical propositions as just illustrated, concern necessary facts and relations, and accordingly, just as they can be used to rule certain historical reports and interpretations out as false or implausible, so can they be used to rule certain other things in as constructively possible, even if such things have never been seen or tried. In complete contrast to the orthodox opinion of the matter, then, elementary social theory shows, and will be explained as showing, that no state, as just defined, can be justified, be it economically or ethically. Rather, every state, regardless of its constitution, is economically and ethically deficient. Every monopolist, including one of ultimate decision-making, is quote-unquote bad from the viewpoint of consumers. Monopoly is hereby understood in its classical meaning as the absence of free entry into a particular line of production. Only one agency, may produce X. Any such monopolist is quote-unquote bad for consumers because, shielded from potential new entrants into his line of production, the price for his product will be higher and the quality lower than otherwise. Furthermore, no one would agree to a provision that allowed a monopolist of ultimate decision-making, i.e. the final arbiter and judge in every case of interpersonal conflict, to determine unilaterally, without the consent of everyone concerned, the price that one must pay for his service. The power to tax, that is ethically unacceptable. Indeed, a monopolist of ultimate decision-making, equipped with the power to tax, does not just produce less and lower quality justice, but he will produce more and more quote-unquote bads, by which I assume they mean social ills, i.e. injustice and aggression. Thus, the choice between monarchy and democracy concerns a choice between two defective social orders. In fact, modern history provides ample illustration of the economic and ethical shortcomings of all states, whether monarchic or democratic. Moreover, the same social theory demonstrates positively the possibility of an alternative social order free of the economic and ethical shortcomings of monarchy and democracy, as well as any other form of state. The term adopted here for a social system free of monopoly and taxation is, quote-unquote, natural order. Other names used elsewhere or by others to refer to the same theory include ordered anarchy, quote-unquote, private property anarchism, quote-unquote, anarcho-capitalism, quote-unquote, auto-government, quote-unquote, private law society, quote-unquote, and of course, pure capitalism, pure unadulterated capitalism. Above and beyond monarchy and democracy, the following is concerned with the quote-unquote logic of a natural order, whether every scarce resource is owned privately. Where every scarce resource is owned privately, where every enterprise is funded by voluntarily paying customers or private donors, and where entry into every line of production, including that of justice, police, and defense services, is free. It is in contrast to a natural order that the economic and ethical errors of monarchy are brought into relief. It is before the backdrop of a natural order that the still great errors involved in democracy are classified as that the historic transformation from monarchy to democracy is revealed as a civilizational decline. And it is because of the natural order's logical status as the theoretical answer to the fundamental problem of social order, of how to protect liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, that the following also includes extensive decisions of strategic matters and concerns, i.e. of the requirements of social change, and in particular the radical transformation from democracy to natural order. Regardless of the unorthodox interpretations and conclusions reached in the following studies, the theories and theorems used to do so are definitely not new or unorthodox by any means. Indeed, if one assumes, as I do, that a priori social theory and theorems exist, then one should also extend that most of such knowledge is old and that theoretical progress is painstakingly slow. This indeed appears to be the case. Hence, even if my conclusions may seem radical or extreme to some, as a theoretician, I am decidedly a conservative. I place myself in an intellectual tradition that stretches back at least to the 16th century Spanish scholastics and that has founded its clearest modern expression in the so-called Austrian school of economics. The tradition of pure social theory as represented above all by Karl Menger, Eugene von Bohm-Bawerk, Ludwig von Mises, and Murray N. Rothbard, for which we have the citation here, C. Murray N. Rothbard, Economic Thought Before Adam Smith, An Austrian Perspective on the History of Economic Thought, Cheltenham, United Kingdom, Edward Elgar. Now we have the next page here, XXII, which I presume to be 22 of the introduction section. At the outset, I noted Habsburg Austria and the United States of America as the countries associated most closely with the old monarchical regime and the new and current democratic republican era, respectively. Here we encounter Habsburg Austria yet again, and discover another reason why the following studies also may be called an Austrian view of the American age. The Austrian school of economics ranks among the most outstanding of the many intellectual and artistic traditions originating in pre-World War I Austria. As one of the many results of the destruction of the Habsburg Empire, however, The school's third generation, led by Ludwig von Mises, was uprooted in Austria and on the European continent and, with Mises' immigration to New York City in 1940, exported to the United States of America. And it would be in America where Austrian social theory has taken root most firmly, owing in particular to the work of Mises' outstanding American student, Murray N. Rothbard. The following studies are written from the vantage point of modern Austrian social theory. Throughout, the influence of Ludwig von Mises and even more of Murray and Rothbard is noticeable. The elementary theorems of political economy and philosophy, which are employed here for the purposes of reconstructing history and proposing a constructive alternative to democracy, have found their most detailed treatment in Mises's and Rothbard's principal theoretical works, for which we here have the citation, Ludwig von Mises, Human Action, A Treatise on Economics, Scholars Edition, Auburn, Alabama, Ludwig von Mises Institute, 1949 to 1991. 1949 in square brackets and 1999 just within generality, which leads me to believe perhaps the book text itself was republished like about a couple decades later. Anyway, continuing here. Murray and Rothbard, Man, Economy, and State. A Treatise on Economic Principles, Auburn, Alabama, Ludwig von Mises Institute, 1962 in square brackets and 1993 in the generality, which tells me originally published 1962, but they're quoting the 1993 edition thereof. And above that, we have, again, with no direct numbered citation, but included on the page, 1995, Idem, Classical Economics, an Austrian Perspective on the History of Economic Thought, Cheltenham, United Kingdom, Edward Elgar, 1995. Also 15 great Austrian economists, Randall Holcombe edition, Auburn, Alabama, Ludwig von Mises Institute of 1999. Now, returning here to the text, where we were before, just a moment here. Here we are. As well, many of the subjects discussed in the following have also been dealt with in their many applied works. Furthermore, the following studies shared with Mises and especially Rothbard a fundamental and robust anti-statist and pro-private property and free enterprise position. This notwithstanding, the following studies can in two regards claim originality. On the one hand, they provide for a more profound understanding of modern political theory. In their applied works, Mises and Rothbard discussed most of the 20th century's central economic and political issues and events: socialism versus capitalism, monopoly versus competition, private versus public property, production and trade versus taxation, regulation and redistribution, etc. And both of them gave detailed accounts of the rapid growth of state power during the 20th century and explained its economically and morally deleterious consequences. However, while they have proven exceptionally perceptive and far-sighted in these endeavors, especially in comparison to their empiricist positivist counterparts, neither Mises nor Rothbard made a systematic attempt to search for a cause of the decline of classical liberal thought and laissez-faire capitalism and the concomitant rise of anti-capitalist political ideologies and statism during the 20th century. Certainly, they did not think of democracy as being such a cause. In fact, although aware of the economic and ethical deficiencies of democracy, both Mises and Rothbard had a soft spot for democracy and tended to view the transition from monarchy to democracy as progress. In contrast, I will explain the rapid growth of state power in the course of the 20th century, much lamented by Mises and Rothbard, as the systematic outcome of democracy and the democratic mindset, i.e. the erroneous belief in the efficiency and/or justice of public property and popular, read majority, rule. On the other hand, based on this deeper, quote-unquote, revisionist understanding of modern history, the following studies arrive also at a better, quote-unquote, clearer and more acute understanding of the constructive alternative to the democratic status quo, i.e., a true natural order. There are detailed explanations regarding the operation of a natural order as a stateless social system with freely financed insurance agencies serving as competitive providers of law and order. And there are equally detailed discussions of strategic matters. In particular, there are detailed discussions specifically of secession and of privatization as the primary vehicles and means by which to overcome democracy and establish a true natural order. Each of the following chapters is self-contained and can be read separately. While this implies some thematic overlap across chapters, they combine into a progressing and expanding theoretical whole. With these studies, I wish to promote, in particular, the tradition of Austrian social theory and contribute to its reputation as not only a bastion of truth, but also as inspiring, exciting, and refreshing. And by the same token, but more generally, I wish to promote and contribute to the tradition of grand social theory, encompassing political economy, political philosophy, and history, and including normative as well as positive questions. An appropriate term for this sort of intellectual endeavor would seem to be sociology. But while the term sociology has been sometimes used in this meaning under the dominant influence of the empiricist positivist philosophy, the term has acquired an altogether different meaning and reputation. According to the empiricist doctrine, normative questions are not, quote-unquote, scientific questions at all, and their existence is no such thing as an a priori theory. That pretty much rules out grand social theory from the outset as, quote-unquote, unscientific. Accordingly, most of what passes nowadays as sociology is not only just plain false, but also irreverent and brutally dull. In distinct contrast, the following studies are everything a good positivist claims one cannot and shall not be: interdisciplinary, theoretically oriented, and dealing with both physical, positive, empirical, and normative questions. I hope to demonstrate by example that this is the right approach as well as the more interesting one. Forward by Hermann Hoppe of Las Vegas, Nevada, September 2000 AD. All right, that concludes the introduction section here, and Chapter 1 on time preference, government, and the process of decivilization will be next. However, at this point in time, I'm about, it says 77 minutes in, which would be about an hour and 17. So yeah, I'm going to cut this off here. It is presently 9:40 a.m. on Thursday, December 20th, 2018. So thank you for joining us, and I do hope you stay with us for the following chapter. Have a good day. Auf Wiedersehen.